Welcome back. In this video, we're going to be looking at Romans chapter 14, which is one of your, it gives you a framework for pretty much any conflict within the church over a disagreement. And it's an ethical disagreement. It's not just like, who makes the coffee or something like that, or whose job something is. It's bigger picture stuff. So this is going to be a little more complicated for the reading. So it'd be good first off to read the whole chapter. This video would be get out of hand if we do all of it at once, but we're going to focus on 1 through 12, but it really isn't going to be a huge transition to the back half too. They're going to be very connected. So go ahead and read all of chapter 14. All the ending of Romans tends to come down to the first two verses of the ending section. So that's chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. That's the living sacrifice verses that may be in your head enough to skip that part. But also for chapter 14, you want to catch the transition in the argument Paul makes. So you go and start like 13:13 and read to the end of 14. You'll kind of get the whole kind of flow that he's doing. So go ahead and do that, and then while you pause and come back. Okay, so if you don't first accept the premise that you're a living sacrifice, none of this is going to make sense. We have no reason to defer to other people's wishes in the way Paul wants. If you don't kind of have yourself living sacrificially, if you count your life as yours and, who cares about what other people think and stuff like that, that attitude just doesn't work for this. I can't even start that conversation with you on this one. You have to accept that you're going to live a life dedicated to loving others and loving your neighbors yourself because you love God so much, and that's the kind of thing He likes. If you're not to that point, this is nonsense. And by the way, this is the life that looks so extraordinary that marks out the church. It's like that we're so known by love. There's a parallel passage that would be very good to actually take a pause and read before you get too deep into that, or to read after you listen to this and just write it down. 1 Corinthians 8, 7 through 13 looks a lot like this, enough that it kind of confuses maybe what's happening in this passage. It's the same principle, maybe in a different situation. And in this passage, this may be the situation that why Paul is butting into conflict in Romans. It may be what he's like, okay, we had to make sure Jews and Gentiles aren't that different before you do this one. But this is the way you should deal with any future problem too. So in this, he seems to be alluding to some conflict in the church that probably is on the Jew-Gentile theme of the church. The whole book of Romans, he's pivoting back and forth, Jew, Gentile, Jew, Gentile, Jew, Gentile. And we do have reason to believe that in this church, there's some real issues there that could have happened. They seem to be meeting in different places. They're a church that might be segregated between Jew and Gentile. It's the only letter that's addressed to multiple churches in Rome instead of like the church in Ephesus. It's like different bodies of believers throughout the city. It could be just the sheer numbers in Rome because this is a big city that's just going to be the way it is, or it could be they're not getting along. He seems at great pains to greet everybody at the end, and there's a mix of Jew and Gentile names trying to show that they reach out, and we see some Jewish names there, which kind of, with the historical context, makes you think it may have gone something like this, where at some point under Emperor Claudius, the Jews got kicked out of Rome, which would have included Christians of Jewish ancestry. Perhaps that would be actually Priscilla and Aquila, who, while they were in exile, ran into Paul and became Christians, as we saw in the book of Acts. And then Nero's in, and Claudius's rules against the Jews are gone, and Jewish Christians are now drifting back into Rome, and the church that they got started, they were probably kind of the sharp edge of spear before. Now they get back and they realize there's a Gentile church already there, and they may not be cohering. Now, what specifically they're arguing about is something that people have debated and debated and debated. And so we got a few clues in this. So, and the very similar passage in 1 Corinthians, the issue seems to be meat sacrificed to idols. And Paul, remember, is in Corinth while he's writing this letter, and that hopefully the rain isn't too distracting behind me. But in that in Corinth, it seems to be some Christians saw idols aren't real, that they're just dead humps of wood. This is good meat, so let's eat. They're not real. This is just meat. Paul seemed to actually take their side in that situation. On the other hand, there's a lot of former idolaters like, I can't eat that. That was sacrifice of idols. You can see how like we don't, and it's like it's an act of worship. Then that's a form of idol worship. I'm not going to do that. And we also saw that the church back in Jerusalem seemed to have ruled in that direction too. There's some warnings in the letters to the different churches in the Book of Revelations that seem to allude to that same issue. It seemed to be a big issue in a lot of churches. Can you eat this meat or not? And there's a reason for that is because like most meat, the butcher shops a lot of times got their meat from the temples, like the temple would sacrifice it, then they sell off the meat, and the selling of the butchers where you'd buy your meat would then like fund it. Also, if you went over to a pagan's house, just like we say grace, they may say, Jupiter. They pray to Jupiter for their meal or something like that. And it's like, if I eat, then does that mean I am showing agreement with worshiping an idol? So it could be that issue that's there. Now sometimes it's more complicated. You think like, okay, the Jews might be the one really picky about it, but for a lot of Jews, after several centuries, the idols weren't particularly real to Jews in the time period of the New Testament. And so once they got over clean and unclean type issues and stuff like that, they might be just fine with it. Whereas a former idol worshiper might be the one that says, I can't do that. I used to worship idols that way. I can't go back to that life. So we're not real sure what side it would have been if there's a Jew-Gentile split on it. And in Corinth, it doesn't seem like it's a Jew-Gentile split. There's a difference of opinion between two groups of Gentile Christians. Well, here in Rome, that could be the issue. But it could also be Jewish dietary restrictions, like clean and unclean meat, feast days, Sabbaths, stuff like that. We see allusions to that. And it also could be flip-flopped. So it could be Jewish Christians coming in, like Priscilla and Aquila saying, I can't eat pork or something like that. And the Gentile Christians doing it anyway, and that means we can't hang out very easily. Or it could be almost the flip-flop. Gentile Christians who had done it themselves, read the old law, and they're trying to do the law that the Jews used to do, short of circumcision. It doesn't bring that up like it does in a lot of other Paul's letters, like in Galatians or Philippians. But it could be that they're trying to do like the Jewish law, but the Jewish Christians, like Priscilla and Aquila, they knew Paul. They were on the same page as Paul, we presume. They seem to be fellow partners in his ministries. So they may actually be like him and not care about clean and unclean if they were Gentiles. And so it may be that these Jewish Christians don't care and the Gentiles are stricter than them, and they're arguing about it. I've heard kind of all quadrants of it, whether it's a idol worship thing or it's a keeping the law thing, and also whether the Jews and Gentiles are flip-flopped or if it's some group between it. And I don't know if we're ever going to really know. So that might be good because a lot of those issues we don't particularly worry about that much. We don't really care about involvement. Idol worship is kind of rare for us. The only time I've ever kind of got caught in ethical conundrum for that on a trip to Europe that I took students to. I remember Hare Krishna's dancing around, and for a Baptist private school that I work at, and like they were dancing around having fun, and a couple of students like went and danced with them. Is that worshiping Krishna, or is that just kind of laughing and dancing around? That's the only time I've ever really seen. I've ever been put in a place where I'm like, I don't know how I feel about this with regard to my faith for that specificness. And dietary restrictions. I guess if I lived in a city where I had a lot of Jewish friends, that could come up more. But that it doesn't really come up much around here. So that's might be good it doesn't mean that this is in the past of the church. What it means is maybe we don't have a dog in this particular fight, so we can actually use it to come up with a principle on how we should always settle arguments. In the Screwtape letters, this passage and the 1 Corinthians 8 passage I told you about are used actually as any sorrel with the demon Screwtape is a C.S. Lewis. They're the two demons dialoguing. Said in any argument over scruples, whether it should or shouldn't do it, basically you should defer to the other. And so he said, like in the Church of England, which had a debate on whether they should cross themselves when they pray, the low church would say, well, that's idolatrous, so we shouldn't do it. And the high church said, well, it's irreverent not to, so we have to do it. And he said, well, and if you really are trying to live like 1 Corinthians 14 says, then each would do the opposite. That the low church person would be so worried about the soul of the high church person, they didn't want to tempt them to irreverence, so they do it. And the high church person is so worried about their brother on the other side who might be led to idolatry that they wouldn't. And so that might be it. So the context I want you to kind of think of on this one, as just presume that you're like 21 on this one, and there's no law issue like in Romans 13 on this, would be like if you're in the American South, where Christians have sort of an expectation that they don't drink. And so that would be kind of a similar one to kind of think through this, where there's a difference of opinion on whether you should or shouldn't among a lot of Christians, something that you probably don't find in Europe or the North or the West as much. And so that would be kind of application thing. Some say you shouldn't, some say you should. Paul's going to set this up in a certain way. So, and I'm not the first to apply this to it. I've seen contracts that for Christian institutions that will reference this chapter and another chapter on trying to say you should not drink. I don't think it's as clear cut as that. But I think it does meddle with your drinking if you do drink. It doesn't stop you. I think it meddles. So let's see. As for the one who's weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. Remember, quarreling and jealousy was right there before it. So if you're weak in your faith, that's saying we can't do that. Remember, for Paul, faith is a freedom from trying to prove yourself from works. So weak in faith would say, I don't know about doing this particular behavior. Strong in faith for this is going to be like, if it's idols, it's saying it's just meat. Or if it's like unclean, it's like God made pigs too. So if it's weak, don't welcome them. Like they're too strict, but we don't want them to run them away for that. One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Now this one's confused some people that what the issue is. Like I'm so into clean and unclean, I'm avoiding it by vegetables. I'm so about avoiding idolatry, I'm going to just do vegetables because no self-respecting God would ever take broccoli as a sacrifice. But I think it actually might, it may be like kind of we see that with the Daniel chapter 1 diet where they're trying to avoid everything. There's a lot of scholarly opinions about why he brings it, and it may just be hyperbole and saying, I'm just going to not do anything just in case. Just, clean living across the board no matter what. But he's saying, he's calling that the weak faith. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. So there's in any sort of situation where there's a difference of opinion on a should or shouldn't do thing, one of those, they're not co-equal. They have a difference. One side of that will typically be the strong side that says, I am free to do this. There's like, I got faith, it's not about the law, and I'm free. That'd be the strong side for Paul, which, by the way, he baseline sides with, though it's going to be complicated. And then there's a weak side. And each has a unique temptation with regard to the other. Now, on different issues, he might be someone strong on this issue, might be weak on another. It's like, oh, I'm free doing that, but I'll never do that. Whatever those scruples are you happen to have, kind of search them in your heart. You do this, and you can kind of see it. It's like, where do you look down on people for being like uptight, maybe be a thing about it, or being too strict, or not being free? He says, don't do that. He says the strong should not look down on the weak. So anything that you're looking down on somebody, that's an indication in your heart that you're kind of taking a strong position. And the temptation of the strong condition is to kind of have contempt on somebody else. It's like, oh, they're still babies on this issue. They're not grown-ups. So to use the example of like Christians drinking, this would be, the people that will have beer at their Bible study and like kind of sort of flippantly mock people who aren't as free as them. That are like, oh, they're still like this, like that the contempt. Okay, the contempt is not love and therefore not welcome. On the other side, if there's something that you're judging somebody as like, oh, they're not a real one, they do that. That's the weak's temptation. It's like to take the thing that you don't feel free to do and to use this as sort of like what you're trusting in, that your temptation would be to judge somebody else. And it says you're not supposed to judge kind of laterally that way. Your temptation would to do it. So anything that you feel judgy on, you're probably on the weak side of this in your discipleship. And he's not saying flip on anything. He's just saying your goal is love. So if you want to be discipled to love, watch that temptation. So so it says, let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains. So the not drinker needs to not judge the drinker, and the drinker needs to not look down on the not drinker. And that's usually the way that would go. So let not the one who abstains pass judgment, because who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? And it's like the Christian that drinks, Jesus example, is someone who works for Jesus. It's not your job to fire them. They don't work for you. Who are you to judge a servant of another? It's not on you to like judge the eater, to judge the person who goes to this kind of movie, or anyone that's having the free behavior. It's not on you to judge the servant of another. It is before his own master that he stands and falls. So it's kind of like a mind your own business, and your business is love. So now, if they invite you in your life, you can have honest and open conversations about this. But it is your ranking is not good for you. Love is to be your response, not ranking. And he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. So saying this person that is walking in this thing that they look at as on the freer side, God can keep them up. Trust God that God's got this situation to some degree, unless he puts it in your path in some way. One person esteems one day better than another. So I think he's talking about the Sabbath here and various holidays, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. So one person is like, every day should be a day I worship Jesus, or some would say we need these special days. I'm going to like wall them off. He's saying whatever you're doing, though, be fully convinced. Do not do things in bad conscience. That's going to be one of the big things there. So this on the weak strong thing, this isn't to convince a not drinker to drink, or a not or a strict Sabbath person to go play kickball on the Sabbath, or to partake of anything that you're not comfortable with. He says, no, that's the opposite of this. Because like if you do an intentional transgression that you aren't fully free, that thinking that it is a transgression, you shouldn't. So if you have any qualms about, say, drinking, don't drink. But also, while you're not drinking, don't judge the ones that do. So, I hope that makes sense. You can't answer questions. It's a video. The one who observes the day observes it as an honor of the Lord. The one who eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God. And while the one who abstains to honor God and gives thanks to him. So each one can be used as a way to honor God. So the eater says, this steak is amazing, and I'm so thankful for God. I'm so thankful that those idols aren't real, and so I can enjoy this cow that, whatever. And you can say, whereas the other person is like, I'm not going to do this because I'm serving God. And you can both be like, awesome, we're both serving God. We're lovingly serving God. And so it's the same, like if you abstain to the Lord in whatever behavior it is. If you do that behavior, you do it to the Lord. If it's a thing you can't do to the Lord, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. And so, the amount of things we can do to the Lord are actually pretty large. So do kind of know that. For none of us lives himself, and none of us dies himself. Because why? We're living sacrifices. Back to 12:1 and 2. So we don't live for us. We're not living to self. We're living for other people. We're living towards God, and we want to serve God, and we're living for other people. So if we are just using whatever our moral quandary is, whether I'm saying I'm living in freedom or I'm being strict, if we are hurting our friend with that freedom or hurting our friend with our strictness, we are wrong. So the if someone's lackadaisical about drinking in front of a non-drinker who's very firmly convinced about it, and you're tempting them to do something that they don't want to do, you're undermining their faith. You're not being free. You're being destructive and unloving and immature in a lot of ways. And the flip side, if the non-drinkers say you're not welcome here to the drinker, they're also putting a stumbling block up. So it kind of that's you have to abstain to the Lord and out of love. For none of us lives himself, and none of us dies himself. For if we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. Because 12:1 and 2 says we sacrifice ourselves to him. For to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. So right now, like whether we're dead or alive, we still belong to him. And that's the good news, because one day when we're dead, that means we still belong to him and we're coming back. Why do you pass judgment on your brother, or why do you despise your brother? For we all stand before the judgment seat of God. We're all before him. And God's the only person that judges us. So why are we taking God's role from him? For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me and every tongue shall confess to God. So then each of us will give an account of himself to God. And so here, whatever you're fighting over, and it's probably, I would think, more Jew and Gentile issues. I think it might be uh, Gentile Christian Jews and Gentile descended Christians following Jewish practices, and Jew and Gentile Christians following Gentile practices. It may be a mix of all of it. If you're breaking the church over this, you're doing it wrong. And that will go for almost anything going forward. This will be like, I think you should dress up for church, or I think you shouldn't. I think you should have drums in church, or I think you shouldn't. Any sort of scruple, this is supposed to be your guidebook to settle it. And it is sort of like almost every disagreement isn't meant to be it's not a challenge, it's an opportunity. That sounds like cheesy like business talk. But each one of these things is meant to be a way God can show off. Wow, a lot of people fight over that, but they just seem to go out of their way to help each other. It's like this person really wants a beer, he's not doing it to respect his friend. And this person's being really chill about this guy, even though he doesn't like it. They kind of love each other. Wow, that's meant to be kind of the engine that's going in this. So that's where I'm leaving you on this one, and we'll kind of pick up on the flip side of this in the next video. Thanks.